Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us again for this new session. And today we'll be discussing one of my favorite concept in SQL, which is the window functions. Some of you might have used this before, and some of you this might be your first time you are learning these functions. But regardless of the situation, there is something for you in this session. All right, so now we're going to quickly talk about the window function. So the window function performs a calculation across a set of rows that are related to the current row called the window, right? Keep that in mind. So think of every row you have in a result set. Now you are calculating base related rows based on that current row. So everything revolves around the current row, then based on whatever frame and parameters or criteria you put in place, then it determines how that current role is going to be calculated or interpreted. Please keep that in mind. And just to compare with group by, it group by collapses rows when you do the calculation, but in window function it does not. So you keep the results per input role. In common use cases here, it's going to be running total, moving averages, rank ordering, and previous or next row comparison. Sometimes also it's just also for elegant view of your code, or sometimes it's just for you to be able to optimize your code in a way that it's really represent the solution you're trying to create. Now let's quickly go over the syntax. So this is just showing you what the canonical ANSI SQL syntax looks like. I won't focus so much on this. Let's focus on this one, but this gives you an idea of what we'll be talking about. But here I want you to focus on this, right? So function name, and then you have your column name or whatever the expression can be a case statement. Now you can take this function name as a sum or a mean, and we're gonna see examples. And then you're gonna have, and this is optional when you say things in these brackets, and then it's optional. So you can have this filter clause, filter with the where clause, and then this is optional, so you could add it or you may not be there. We're going to look at that as well. And then over is when you begin to define the window function, and then you either use a window name or window definition. Now if you had to use a window definition, what does that really means? Now that simply means, again, I say it could be an existing window name. We're going to get to that, but it will start with partition by. So partition by is more or less your group by. So think of partition by as your group by. So you can specify one or two partitions or multiple partitions, columns you want to partition by. But in this case, you can just put the expression right here, and then it will be followed by order by, right? And then the same syntax you use for order by applies here, where you can specify ascending, descending. You can use operators. You can say nulls first or last. We've gone through this if you're following our previous session. And then you have the frame clause, right? And so for this frame clause, I'm gonna just quickly go over it here. So it could be range, you could use range, rows, and groups. So it could be one of them. It cannot be two of them at the same time, but it can just be one. So most times in these sessions, we'll be using our rows, okay? And then you would have what we call frame start and frame exclusion, or better say between the frame start and frame end and frame exclusion. Now when we talk about frame start and frame end, what does that look like? Now frame start and frame end could either be unbounded preceding. Think of this as rows before the current row, right? Offset preceding. So if you want to specify a particular offset rows, then you would use this function. We don't often use this. Current row will mean the current row that we are trying to calculate on, and then the offset following and unbounded following. So again, here you say rows before the current row. This is going to be rows after the current row. We're going to dive into this. I really want you to understand this frame, because this is where some of those interesting calculations happens. Now, you'll see we also have frame exclusion. Again, this is optional. You can see this is optional. And so you could have had some frame exclusion saying exclude current role, exclude group, exclude ties, exclude no other. We're going to look at some examples here, but that's really how the expressions. And then it kind of explained to you the over, partition by, order by, and all that I've just explained. Feel free to go through that. And also, one of the cool thing you can do with Windows function is that you can have a name Windows. What that simply means is that if you notice that within your query you're having to repeat a particular Windows declaration or window definition for multiple derived column, what you then need to do is just represent with whatever alphabet you want to use. In this case, we call it W. You can see over W, and then what happens is at the end of your query, just define the W. I must say at this point that it's not all the of the SQL system that support this, but Spark SQL, PostgreSQL do support it. So, and then you can see here, you can then define your, more like you're defining a variable here, you're defining this Windows variable. And you can say W then equals to partition by customer ID, order by order date, and then you have the frame clause right here. All right, and then you have the various frame types. I won't go over this for the purpose of our discussion in this particular 30-day challenge. We're going to be using rows, right, which is based on physical row count. Range also has its purpose, group has its purpose. And I want to also emphasize here, and we're going to touch on it in our demo, is that the default frame rules, it's usually, especially once you add the order by, it default to this, right? So it defaults to not necessarily range, it defaults to rows between unbounded preceding and current row, okay? And it could also just be range. Range and rows work similarly, but they have some nuance around their differences. But it default, what I want you to focus on is that it default to between unbounded preceding and the current one. This is very key to take note. And when you're specifying your ranking offset function, always make sure you can ignore the frame clauses, but always make sure you include the ordering pattern, okay? And always use rows except if you really need to use range or groups. Why? Is because it's deterministic in nature, right? It's very pragmatic in nature. All right, now these are the various categories of window functions we'll be looking into: ranking and row numbering. I've put in here the functions, and some of them will be seen in the demo. And also the second one here is navigation functions. We have the lag and lead and end value, and you can see how they are being expressed. And here also we have the positioner function, first value and last value. And then you have the aggregation, which we're going to start with. And then you have the percentile and quantize. This we won't discuss, it's beyond the scope of this challenge, but feel free to know that they do exist. And also we have the statistical window functions, right? This will be applicable for those that are having to do some mathematical calculations, or that really needs to do use this statistic calculation. And again, is engine specific or engine dependent, and it's very key to take note. We won't deal with this as well in this challenge. And also I also put in here some of the variations in terms of the dialect differences, so what Postgres do support. One thing to take note there: PostgreSQL support filter, exclude groups, percentile count, and you can see in SQL Server it doesn't include that. No filter, no exclude. And then Snowflake, BigQuery, feel free to go through that. Some of the common pitfalls and best practices to take note is that always specify order by for meaningful ranking or offsets. Logic, explicitly define the frame for last value. We're going to deal with it as well and show why that is important. Always prefer to use rows. I've said that over range for deterministic running totals. Hard tiebreaker to order by for stable ranking. Be careful with entire bucket sizes. Avoid extend inside window aggregates when unsupported. So usually you don't need the extend, but in some cases you do need the extend. Okay, and so just keep that in mind. All right, with that, let's go to our first demo of aggregation, where we'll be looking at this and looking at how the syntax is being represented, and that will be in our next video. Thank you so much for watching this one, and I look forward to see you in the lab. All right, thanks.